Vanakkam. Hello friends. We saw in the previous episodes about the emergence of chieftancy in the Aindinai landscapes of ancient Tamizhagam. Warrior chieftains who controlled natural resources and the important trade routes and protected their clan from conflicts that were mostly cattle raids. We also saw how in due course of time, clan settlements combined together to protect themselves better against these increasing conflicts and elected among themselves a more powerful chieftain to rule as a king, a Vair. Thus, a chieftain who ruled from a single province as a Cittaraser went on to become a Vain, then a king who presided over a few village settlements brought together as a unit called a Nadu. By today's definition, a Nadu could be described as the geographical territory covered by a single district in the state of Tamil Nadu. So, what led to the forming of a Nadu with the Vendan? The people living in the Mullai and Marudam plains needing to protect themselves against recurring cattle raids. Though Tolkappiyam presents a highly conventionalized picture of warfare in its Purathinai, and also describes the different stages of cattle raiding about which we have seen in detail. I will leave the relevant link here. As a work of grammar, its primary concern was with the literary form and hence it does not reflect the realities of the social and political life of the Tamil people. For this, we need to turn to the corpus of Sangam literature. Commentators of Tolkappiyam, who came a good 10 to 12 centuries later than the dating of the work, were influenced by the social setup that prevailed during their time, which colored their perception of interpreting the original texts. And some of the historians and scholars who came even later were influenced by the opinions of the commentators and were often misguided. In his landmark work, Sangam Polity, the noted historian Professor N. Subramaniam presents a remarkable study of the political conditions of the Sangam age as revealed by Sangam poetry. Taking a cue from a few early commentators, he goes on to explain how cattle raiding was an almost noble act conducted before the start of a war in order to protect the cattle, as they were the most essential part of the economy of the land, and also because of religious tradition that held the cows as sacred. His interpretation of cattle raiding is influenced by Brahmanical ideology, points out the renowned historian M.G.S. Narayanan of the Calicut University, who served as chairman of the Indian Council of Historical Research. He points out, and I quote, "There's a pronounced tendency to rationalize and legitimize many practices portrayed in crude form in the poems themselves." Well, by poems, he means the corpus of the Sangam works. He shows how Purananuru, that belonged to one of the earliest strata of the Sangam works, was secular in nature and devoid of miracles and largely free from supernatural elements. There was no such holy association with the cattle, not even on ethical or political grounds. If one looks at several references in both the Agananuru and the Purananuru, cattle lifting was not always done on the order of a king. Neither was it a precursor to a war. Quite a few poems in Agananuru, the so-called love anthems, describe rather gory scenes of cattle raiding. If we were to see a couple of examples, in Agananuru poem 97 sung by Mamulanar, set in the backdrop of the Pai landscape, where the heroine is lamenting to her friend, the Tori, of how the hero has left her and gone in search of wealth, and how his journey takes him through a very harsh Palai landscape. Kalliyam Katta Pulliyam Purikalai starts the poem, where Kalliyam is the dry, barren forest of the Kalli, that is the cactus trees. The poem goes on to describe the horrors of the forest, which is smelling of foul meat, the smell emerging from the snatches of meat left on the bones and horns of the male deer that has been eaten by the predators in the forest. The stench attracted the large-headed vultures who came there in search of leftovers, and this is used as a simile by the heroine to describe the Kolai will Adavar, the men who have the fearsome bow and arrow, who go into the neighboring villages and kill the sleeping villagemen at night and steal their cattle, and then feast on the meat on the rocky slopes, leaving behind chunks of meat. They come back again in search of the leftovers. So here the simile is comparing these bow wielding men to the vultures. And she says, this is the kind of forest that my hero is passing through. The scene is clearly talking about wayside robbers who are marauding the Mullai people of their cattle. In yet another poem from the Agana Nuru, song number 309, sung by Karuvur Kandapillai Chatanar, here again, the heroine is describing a horrible scene in the forest through which her hero is passing through, separated from her. வயவாள் எரிந்து வில்லின் நீக்கி பயம் நிறை தழிய கடுங்கன் மழவர் அம்புசேன் படுத்து வன்புலத்து உய்த்தன தெய்வம் சேர்ந்த பராரை வேம்பில் கொழுப்பா எரிந்து குருதி தூவோய் புழுவு புழுக்கு உண்ட வான்கண் அகலரை. Goes the poem. Here the scene described the warriors, the Malavar, who have plundered milk-yielding cattle, are driving them through the Palai regions, waving their victorious swords and shooting far-flung arrows. They congregate under the neem tree wherein resides the spirit god and slaughter a fat cow, offer it to the god, sprinkling its blood all over the place and feasting on its meat. While a few poems do show that cattle raiding was carried out by chieftains at the instance of a king, sometimes as a prelude to war, many poems like this one show that the activity was not a part of a larger political scheme, but merely a practice of spontaneous greed and lawlessness in a rather primitive tribal society. In Purananuru, there is a very interesting song, poem 258, sung by Ulochanar, set in the Vanjitine, that is cattle raiding, under a specific subdivision, that is a Thurai known as Undatu, which refers to the warriors drinking toddy and dancing around. The song itself is addressed to a toddy seller. Here, the poet mentions how the hero has brought a big herd of cattle after a raid and exchanges them for toddy and supplies all his warriors with toddy and the meat, and he himself, having drunk and feasted, simply rubs his blood-stained hands on his bow and sets out to conduct yet another cattle raid. And here the poet Ulochanar tells the toddy tapper, the hero is soon going to be back with an even larger herd of cattle, enough to fill this place. He will come back thirsty, and you know that he likes toddy, and he will look to barter some more of his cattle for the drink. He will be back even before the Malavar who are seated in feast will finish eating. So be ready and set aside a cask of mature toddy, Palankal, he says. So here this shows that cattle raids were not always pre-planned, and quite often they occurred spontaneously as a result of drinking and merrymaking, and so common was this occurrence that Tolgapiyam even defined this under a subdivision, a Thurai known as Undatu. In Puram 259, the poet Perumbudanar warns an owner whose cattle has just been stolen not to go in foolish pursuit of retrieving them. He says, the Maravar clansmen who came and stole the cattle must be herding them off in a haste, but not all of the clansmen would have left. Some of them, with their large bow and arrows, should be hiding behind the leafy woods. And though the cattle owner himself is a very valiant hero, the poet warns him not to run into an ambush. The inference here is that the cattle raid seems to have been conducted when the owner and his men were not in station, thereby clearly an act of theft for profit. Sangam literature shows how cattle raiding was a way of life for the tribal people like the Maravar. Their notions of heroism, wealth, honor and pride were all centered around the cattle raiding practices. A violent spirit of lawlessness was demonstrated and celebrated by them. Continuing conflicts between the cattle raiders of the highlands and the cattle keepers of the plains was thus part and parcel of everyday life during the Sangam age. We saw in the previous episode how from chieftaincy evolved landed aristocracy, especially in the Marudam regions, where the landowners, the Ulavar and the Velalar, owned fertile tracts of land, and the more powerful among them emerged first as the chieftains and then as the Velir, and in due course, in return for protection against such marauders, these chieftains owned their allegiance to one king or the other. These chieftains exercised powers of autonomy within their limited regions but owed some sort of allegiance to the king. They later on became generals in the military or ministers to the king. With continuous conflicts being somewhat of a way of life in early primitive Tamizhagam, the lust for power and the need to control led the kings to wage war on one another and also on disobedient chieftains. And what seemed to have followed is that in order to strengthen their armies, the kings recruited the fearsome warriors of the highlands from the Malavar, the Kadambar, the Vetuvar clans. And how did they ensure the loyalty and allegiance of these warriors? By conferring titles and honors on them. For example, Enadi was a very important title that was conferred on a chieftain who led an army. And in the Kalitohai, there is a reference to Yenadi Padiyam, where a king honored his distinguished general with a ring, an Yenadi, which was studded with precious stones and carried the royal insignia. According to the Tolgapiyam, Marayam was another title that kings bestowed on chieftains who accompanied them on expeditions. In the inscriptions of the medieval period, there are several references to this Marayam honor. The recipients of the honor were known as Marayan and their wives were called Marasi. Some of the other means by which the king ensured the loyalty of these warriors is by conducting grand feasts, giving authorized as well as unauthorized war loot, and distribution of lifted cattle. Ironically, united under a Vendan to resist and protect themselves against a cattle raid, now the king himself, as a means of weakening the enemy, sanctioned cattle raids. All this is attested to by Sangam poetry. In due course of time, the king also sanctioned lands to these warrior clans, as found in references from the Purananuru. Such warrior settlements of the Maravar and Vetuvar signified a special kind of a village settlement often found in dry tracts in remote inaccessible forest regions. They were not agricultural lands, at least initially. Inhabited by warriors who indulged in hunting, they seem to have been full-time soldiers in the royal service at the beck and call of the king, who was engaged in incessant warfare. In a Purananuru song, poem 326, sung by Tangal Porkollan Bennaganar, the poet eulogizes the chieftain and his wife for their generous hospitality. Sung under the Vahittinai, which signifies the victory of a chieftain in cattle raid, under a Thurai known as Vallan Mullai, where the poet sings and praises the valor of the chieftain, the poem goes, Urmudu Veli Parnadai Verihin, Irul Pagai Veriya Nagu Ilampedai, Uir Nadukutru, புலாவிட்டரற்ற சிறையும் செற்றையும் புடைய நல் எழுந்த பருத்திப் பெண்ணின் சிறுதி விளக்கத்து கவிர்பூ நெற்றிச் சேவலின் தனியும் அருமிளை இருக்கை அதுவே மனைவியும். A very beautiful setting where this poet has gone to visit the chieftain in his village, which is in an interior forest region, and the scene describes how a wild cat is stealthily coming into the fence of the chieftain's house, and seeing the cat in the dark, must have been early in the morning, say maybe 4 o'clock, the hen shrieks at the top of its lungs, and at that time the lady of the house wakes up and comes out with a lamp in her hand in order to clean the region of its leaves and branches, and here she is described as Paruthi Pendir. And once she comes, in the light of the lamp, the hen sees the young cock and at once is pacified and keeps quiet. Here, the poet induces a beautiful simile. Living in the midst of the wild forest, exposed to the elements and marauders, the lady of the house should be living in constant fear. But just as she knows at the sight of her husband, who is a great fighter in the king's army, she at once gets comforted and her mind is silenced. A very beautiful description, Kavirpu, which is the mulmurunge, the flowers of which are red, which looks akin to the cock's head. The poet goes on to describe how in that humble household the children of the chieftain have hunted a kind of lizard, a udukai, from nearby waters and have made a porridge by mixing it with curd, and this simple food is offered to the poet and the guests who had arrived with him. And then he says, the chieftain, who had killed many an elephant in the king's war, has brought home the gold ornaments that adorned the elephant, and this the warrior chief shares with the poets. Thus, the warrior chief was a small king in his own province with his own rusty coat and camp followers, ruling over a small, dry, remote village assigned to him by the king. And the Sangam poets have eulogized a number of chieftains who were invariably great patrons of art and letter. Aviyar Perumahan Behan, Kuravar Perumahan Yere, Malavar Perumahan Mavan Ori, Malavar Perumahan Anji, Kalvar Perumahan Pulli goes some of the lines in the Sangam works. These references clearly indicate that Anji, Behan, Yere, Pulli and Ori were chieftains of their respective tribes and clans. Thus, though there was no elaborate administration or state missionary imposed by a king, the bonds which brought the king and the village lords together provided some sort of rough governance to these remote villages. We will continue to explore the alliances that were formed between the kings and the chieftains and the hierarchies that came about, the new kinds of lands that were sanctioned to them, and how in time the kings became ruthless, not only in order to keep their enemies in bay, but also to keep disobedient chieftains in check in the coming episodes. Vanakkam.